We are in priority area 3 now. We looked at this a little bit when we did the executive summary in the beginning. So if you want more details, you can go through these podcasts. And of course, the report is available online from the World Bank, which is much more useful to read since I tend to be brief, or at least you can complement these podcasts with the book. Priority Area 3 is on helping firms and people manage residual risks and natural disasters. Residual risks are, of course, what are left even after the government has done its thing. Private companies have done their own things, people have done their own things, and then natural disasters come along. And we had looked at the concept of acceptable and non-acceptable risks, for example, and who shares what burden. So this one could be in the interior or environment in terms of ministries. No matter how much private sector, let me bring up the laser pointer. No matter how much private actors and governments try to reduce people's exposure or make their assets more resistant to natural hazards and climate change, they cannot reduce the risk to zero. Right? Disasters will continue to inflict damage, so it's vital to supplement actions on exposure and vulnerability with improvements in people's ability to cope with the unavoidable shocks. A government's first function is ensuring disaster management instruments are available to all firms and households, for example, through insurance regulations, underwriting risks, and making sure people don't go and settle in danger zones like flood zones or fire zones, wildfires, woods. And since ensuring safety and security and managing emergencies and crises is one of their main functions, governments also have an important role to play in ensuring that all private actors cope with and recover from disasters and climate impacts, using tools ranging from social protection to emergency response and humanitarian interventions. So sometimes crises happen, natural hazards, and then the entire community is devastated. Then humanitarian interventions play a role with aid agencies potentially coming from beyond the borders, right? Especially when it's a poor country. You don't have countries rushing into US to help US with disaster management, but if it's in the global south, this happens a lot. Taking action and screening questions. Let's look at identifying actions to cope with and recover from unavoidable shocks. There are always unavoidable shocks like earthquakes, volcanoes, etc. While effective risk mitigation can go a long way in reducing loss and damage, some natural shocks are too extreme and intense to be prevented. Governments need strategies to ensure that when disasters do occur, people and firms can cope without devastating long-term consequences, and they can recover quickly, so resilience is important as well. The following questions can help decision makers identify shortcomings and guide them towards the actions needed to manage residual risks. Problems identified, questions asked, answers prepared, strategies designed to deal with the answers, and tactics to implement the strategies, right? Action 3.2, strategy to manage residual risks. Does the country have a comprehensive strategy for managing residual climate and natural risks? This should include economy-wide strategy to manage residual risks and disasters. Households and firms have access to necessary financial instruments to manage small and big shocks, like rebuilding versus resettling somewhere else, for example. Action 3.3, I don't know why I jumped to 3.2 and 3, but let's start with 3.1. Sorry about that. Early warning systems. I'm a big fan of this, and I work on some of these myself in terms of water, food, energy, health, transportation, etc. Do people have universal access to effective early warning systems for natural hazards? These should include effective communication channels, warnings with clear recommended actions. There are also so-called last mile problems where people are trained to watch out for and assimilate and take action based on these early warnings, which are effective already because of the early work. Is the country prepared to manage large-scale evacuations? Should include adequate and inclusive shelters, evacuation plans. India got tested again on this when Cyclone Biparjoy hit Gujarat in June of 2023, just a few weeks ago, and it evacuated tens of thousands of people and reduced the number of deaths to just 2, which is a remarkable accomplishment considering the strong cyclone and the dense populations, etc. So let's go back to action 3.2 and read it again. Strategy to manage residual risks. Does the country have a comprehensive strategy for managing residual climate and natural risks? This should include economy-wide strategy to manage residual risks and disasters. Households and firms have access to necessary financial instruments to manage small and big shocks. Action 3.3 then, insurance and other financial instruments to underwrite risks. Are financial services equipped to provide people with accessible services in post-disaster situations? Could include, not should, could include readiness of financial sector to provide access to savings, loans and remittances in a disaster aftermath. Do households and firms have access to disasters insurance? Are these services affordable, right? Having insurance is good, but if the premiums are so high that most people cannot afford it, then it's not a very effective tool. Could include penetration rate of disaster insurance among households and firms, ratio of premium to expected claim amounts. So people have to get the information, be signed up, incentivized to buy these insurances, and then the premiums have to correspond to the claims they can be expected to make in case of actual disaster happening and causing them losses. Action 3.4, adaptive social protection. Are households covered by a social protection scheme that can provide disaster support? This should include stress-tested systems that can deliver payments in a post-disaster context. For example, if power is interrupted, which happens very commonly when Cyclone Biparjoy hit Gujarat, hundreds and hundreds of light poles were knocked out. Hopefully power was restored fairly quickly and people got compensation or protection for dealing with life without power. You know, can come in many ways. Power stations to charge up phones and other emergency equipments and so on. Does the country have a registry of potential beneficiaries in case of major disasters and the ability to make quick transfers to them? This is especially important to have digitized systems where people are registered, bank accounts linked up, so financial flows can be smooth. India is getting better and better at this, for example. And that reduces corruption as well. If you are handing out cash, you can be sure that things will get stolen along the way before they get to the actual deserving recipients. For example, in Kenya, all householders in the regions covered by the Hunger Safety Network program are registered and have a bank account on file to ensure quick transfers. So bank accounts are critical and registered systems are clear, registry systems. Action 3.5, business continuity plans or BCPs. Are firms required to prepare business continuity and contingency planning? So that has to be regulated and enforced. These could include regulation, tax incentives, or technical support available to develop such plans. Having a regulation is one thing, but to actually make people, firms and people adhere to these regulations may require help, support. Does the government have contingency plans to support affected firms? Tax relief, reconstruction subsidies, or emergency loans are some of the tools that could be included in this. Going to action 3.6, capacity to build back better. Are disaster recovery and reconstruction plans designed to avoid long-term lock-in of risk so that earthquake happens and you build again in a vulnerable area without proper safety codes, building codes, or flood happens, landslide happens, as is happening in parts of northern India in the Himalayan foothills already this monsoon, and people build back again. So resilience has to be built in, and these could include not developing areas that may be prohibitively expensive to protect in the long term. So people rebuild, and then you want to protect them against residual risks, help them protect themselves against residual risks, and that could turn out to be just too expensive. Moving people away from centuries or decades of roots where they have laid the roots and stayed there is very, very, very difficult. Are plans in place to build back stronger, faster, and fairer after large-scale disasters? These could include pre-contracting debris removal tasks, procurement agreements for essential services, and such. Okay. Let me leave this podcast here, maybe fairly short, but nonetheless I want to leave them short enough to get your attention and not lose you along the way. So I'll come back and continue this priority area 3 on helping firms and people deal with residual risks. We looked at helping firms and people adapt. Now we are looking about talking about residual risks and natural disasters. Okay.